Crioso, and welcome back to the Welsh History Podcast, episode 235, Charlotte Guest, Cultural Icon in Victorian Wales. In this episode, we're going to dive into the story of a pioneering woman whose influence on industry, literature, and Welsh culture left a lasting legacy. Charlotte Guest, the wife of Sir Josiah John Guest. Born Charlotte Bertie in 1812, she grew up in a world of privilege, and in an English world at that. Yet she possessed a keen intellect and a drive to engage with the world beyond high society. Even still, she appears to have particularly enjoyed the refuge of her garden, as she spent a lot of time in it and developed a dislike for being kept inside. As her mother withdrew from family life because of illness, Charlotte was often the woman of the house, and she would be in charge of her younger siblings. Yet, ever since her youth, she had had a keen interest in both politics and in learning languages and study. Charlotte showed a great aptitude for languages and literature, and she taught herself Arabic, Hebrew, Persian, as well as studying Latin, Greek, French, and Italian with her brother's tutor. When she married Josiah Guest, or John Guest, as he is more frequently known, in 1833, she entered the heart of industrial Wales in a place vastly different from the aristocratic circles of her youth. However, due to her understanding of languages, she was able to learn Welsh after her marriage and put that knowledge to good use. Charlotte wasn't just the spouse of an industrial magnate. She was a formidable force in her own right. Her contributions to Merthyr Tydfil in the mid-19th century extended far beyond the confines of the home, stretching into the realms of business, education, and literature. Historian Angela John, who I will be quoting quite frequently, or at least using a lot of what she wrote about her, because she's done a few seminal articles and books on the subject, and she has explored her life in great depth, shedding light on the crucial role that she played in the advancement of the iron industry and Welsh heritage. So what we're going to do is spend some time talking about this woman and her life and why she was so significantly important to Wales. In case you don't know, in the early and to mid-19th century, Merthyr Tydfil has become a bustling industrial powerhouse, home to the Dowlais Ironworks, the largest of its kind, and under the leadership of Guest, Dowlais thrived, producing iron that helped to build railways, bridges, and ships across both Britain and beyond. But behind the scenes of this industrial empire was Charlotte Guest, an educated and ambitious woman whose influence helped to shape not just the company, but the community. Over her time living there, she learned Welsh and associated with leading literary scholars of the Abergavenny Welsh Society, Cymdeithas Cymregion I Fyny, notably including Thomas Price and John Jones, or Tegid as his bardic name was called, who supported and encouraged her in her work. Unlike many women of her time, Charlotte took an active role in her husband's business, and as historian Angela John describes, she meticulously learned about operations of the ironworks, understanding the technical and managerial aspects that kept the industry running. When her husband passed away in 1852, Charlotte didn't retreat into widowhood. She took control, overseeing the vast enterprise for several years until her son was old enough to take the reins. Her business acumen and leadership ensured that the Dowlais Ironworks continued to thrive. She fought to improve working conditions and introduced education programs for workers and their families. She recognized the importance of literacy and knowledge in an industrial town like Merthyr Tydfil. Despite the rapid industrialization of the town, social order and worker compliance were carefully maintained. Industrialists like Guest, and later his wife, recognized the importance of preventing labor unrest, particularly in a period when industrial action and early trade unionism were on the rise. Now, I have to admit, in reading Johns' writing on this subject, it's pretty obvious that a lot of historians today view this movement amongst the industrialists as a paternalistic movement, which sought to be, in quotes, the father of the business. They wanted to present themselves as caring for their workers, and that they themselves knew best what the workers wanted and needed. This was fairly common in the Victorian era, and you can understand why, offering various reforms, better pay, better education, and work hours for children, and in some cases, housing, which in and of itself may or may not have been great, were considered to be benefits to the workers, and they did have a semblance of social control built in, because if you keep the workers happy, shocked, and surprised, there's a lot less likelihood they're going to reject the company and or cause strikes or walkouts. Guest was one of the industrialists who was someone who, with his business, made his own riches. He did not come from a aristocratic background, and he did not lean into that idealism. In fact, he was a radicalist politically, and he was seen as someone who understood his workers. He would be someone, rich though he obviously was, who cared about the little guy and their lack of voice in government, which is one of the views of the radical Whigs that had developed over the years. And he would be someone who would try and push for an agenda which responded to the problems that were going on within the community of the workforce. And if we view this through a modern lens, it might suggest that he was doing this for his own profit, but we have to understand that at the same time, you can tell that there was some sense of responsibility in this. What I've noticed in reading Johns' writing is that she herself was not as positive on this, and she had a very negative viewpoint on some of this. She does look at Guest and her husband as being somewhat different, John and Charlotte, who were legitimately trying to make a difference, trying to change society, but not everybody was, and not everybody understood what they were attempting to do, and a lot of times struggled to try and understand why the guests were so excited on these subjects and why they were pushing so hard for it. And as she would view it, Charlotte played a crucial role in fostering a sense of stability amongst the workforce. Through its philanthropy, education programs, and provisions of housing and welfare support, the Guest family did ensure that workers remained relatively content and reduced the likelihood of strikes or organized resistance. By improving literacy and living conditions, Charlotte not only contributed to social welfare, but also reinforced a system in which workers remained dependent on their employer for economic security and well-being. Historians have noted that this strategy is not unique to the Guests, and many industrial wives in South Wales, including individuals such as Rosemary Crochet, engaged in similar acts of social control, balancing genuine concern for worker welfare with an underlying interest in preserving labor stability and loyalty to the family enterprise. This approach helped to ensure that labor action in places like Merthyr Tydfil remained minimal compared to other regions experiencing unrest during this same period. I get that this would be an obvious outcome, but I guess the rejoinder would be, is it really so much worse? Most industrialists were concerned about coin. Workers, as I have tried to show in the past few episodes, were not necessarily their concern and didn't really bother them what would happen to them, and their welfare wasn't important to them. They were little different from the machines or tools that they worked with. If you broke them, you replaced them. While it's reasonable to understand that industrialists remained basically loyal to protecting their own wealth, it can also be seen that there is a concern about the well-being of others. Labor peace, driven by better conditions, better education, better housing, was a key part of allowing the next generation to use their education to better themselves. It allowed people to get out of the squalor of their existence and be able to move out from the bounds that they were placed in. Maybe this was an unexpected or unintended consequence, yet it was an important one. Better conditions and home health created opportunities and life expectancy increases. At the end of the day, it's not so simple as it may appear, and maybe the consequences were much better for society than those of us looking backward might understand it in our viewpoint. Beyond business and literature, Charlotte was a tireless advocate for education and social reform. She established a school at Dowlais to provide children of the ironworks with an education, something that was far from guaranteed in industrial Britain. She believed that education was key to progress, not just for the privileged, but for all members of society. Her work in this field reflects a progressive vision, one that it was unusual for a woman of her time. She believed in the people of South Wales and the workers of her factory, even as they protested and rebelled against authority. She felt pity for the leaders of the Rebecca riots who were sent into exile. In the aftermath of the Newport riots, when tensions were high amongst labor and factory owners, Charlotte made a point to visit the factory floor and felt totally at peace with the workers. She held that her loyalty to them was as important as their loyalty to her company. As she described the factory workers, she said of them, quote, "Our own men are good and true," end quote. She also expressed sympathy for the Chartists, some of whom she knew personally, and felt strongly that more should be done for the laborers and advocated for any of those who would listen. She would back that up by working to expand educational opportunities for children of workers across South Wales. She tried to convince her fellow industrialist women to help fund schools to some degree of success. Oftentimes, she would lead the fundraising efforts and cajole and drag her fellow women into funding it, who would obviously be cajoling and pleading of their husbands, who likely controlled a lot of the money at the time. She often expressed privately and publicly her desire to do more. In the midst of the unsettling revolutions in Europe in 1848, she wrote in her journal, quote, "May we indeed be enabled to do them good, and under a reviving trade have it in our power to minister to their necessities, not only bodily but mentally. May we, by our care and unceasing attention to their improvements in every respect, that in some measure justify the warmth their reception has evinced towards us." End quote. Guest was not a typical woman of the period. As she was personally involved in the running of the factory, she learned books and accountancy while also becoming the pseudo-HR department of the business. However, it must be noted that for all her achievements, she was still a woman in the age of men. As much as she tried to fight for clean water, for example, or better sanitation and other efforts to clean up Merthyr Tydfil, she always ran into the iron worker industrialists who would shut her out of meetings and did not highly respect her because of her gender. This is part of the reason why she went to their wives to try and cajole them into helping. Still, as her husband fell into illness and eventually died, she was a key member of the business, as she had been learning all of the parts of the business, and had over time taken on a larger role in how the company was run. Her understanding of Welsh and the culture likely helped her working with the men and dealing with the issues that they had both inside and outside of the company. As we talk about her efforts in the industrial landscape of Wales, let us now turn to her work in changing the cultural one. When Guest arrived in Wales, as we mentioned, she was already an expert in 7 languages. As she lived in Wales, she sought to learn the language as well, and as she learned Welsh, she began to associate it with leading literary scholars of the previously mentioned society from Abergavenny. Notably, this included Thomas Price and John Jones, who supported and encouraged her in her work. Her willingness to learn the language immediately endeared her to her local Welsh intelligentsia that she spent time with. who saw her as a link between the Welsh-speaking radicals and people like her husband, who served as an MP for Merthyr and was himself considered a radical. As described by Taliesin Williams, the son of Iolo Morganwy, Guest had, unlike other English migrants who saw, quote, our national habits and our indefeasible attachments to the ancient language with jealous unkindness, end quote, Guest, on the other hand, quote, adopted our costume and our language from the first day she honored Merthyr with her residence, end quote. Far from seeming alien, Guest became a part of the community and represented a different side to the ideals of the British elites. Instead of being seen as different and needing conformity, she saw Welsh language and culture, and much like a myriad of other languages she had learned, appreciated it for what it was. She especially appreciated the romantic aspects of the language. The idea of looking at the past really attracted her a lot, and it was something that she focused in on quite frequently. And through that time, started to develop an interest in translating Welsh documents and Latin documents into English. She had begun by translating several medieval songs and poems, and then in 1837 began on the Mabinogion, or the Mabinogi, depending on how you want to phrase it. John Jones borrowed a copy from the Llyfr Coch Hergest manuscripts for her from Judge Bos Sanquit, who's originally commissioned him to transcribe a copy when Jones was a young scholar at Oxford. The first tale that Charlotte translated was from Jones's transcription of The Lady in the Fountain, or Owen, which was well received when it was published in 1838. Some characters from the tales had been profiled in William Owens Pugh's Myfyriwr and Archaeology of Wales. Pugh published a translation of the first episode of Pwyll from the first branch of the Mabinogi in 1795 and again in 1821. He made a complete translation of all the tales, but the work was unpublished at his death in 1835. Guest, as it turned out, did not rely on Pugh's translation, though she did use a Welsh dictionary that Pugh had completed in 1803. This Mabinogion, as it became, was the first translation of the materials to be published in modern print format. It was published in several volumes between 1838 and 1845, with the first volumes dedicated to Guest's favorite Arthurian material. In 1849, the work was then republished in 3 volumes, Volume 1 containing the Welsh romance Owen, Prydwr, and Geraint and Enid. Volume 2 contained Culhwch ac Olwen and the Dream of Rhonabwy. Volume 3 contained the 4 branches of the Mabinogi and Taliesin. Geraint and Enid in Volume 1 was the basis for Alfred Lord Tennyson's 2 poems about Geraint in the Idyllis of the King. The 7-volume series that we mentioned from 1838 from 1845 and the 3-volume set in 1849 were all bilingual, presenting Jones's transcribed Welsh text alongside Guest's English translation. They included copious scholarly footnotes, mainly in English, totaling 145 pages in all, and they were lavishly produced with full illustrations and gold-tooled leather covers. All volumes were then published simultaneously in Llandovery, Wales, by the Ton Press and by Longmans in London. Charlotte's interest in translation stemmed from her deep intellectual curiosity and her passion for preserving and sharing cultural heritage. She recognized that the ancient Welsh stories held significant historical and literary value. She was determined to make them accessible to a wider audience. Her meticulous translations of these works set a new standard in literary scholarship and inspired future generations of historians and linguists to explore and document Welsh literature. This contribution to the history of Wales and the mythology was a key part in growing sense of Welsh nationalism that had begun to rise in this era. As I've mentioned before, culture is the key to the rise of this nationalization, along with the language, both of these working side by side to create a sense of Welsh independence, or at least a Welsh sense of self that maybe had been falling off in the period before this. Offering these English translations allowed these stories to spread beyond the bounds of Gymraeg speakers, and it was a critical part in preserving these stories. Historian John highlights how Charlotte's work was a groundbreaking one. Before her translations, these stories, rich in mythology and folklore, were largely unknown outside of Wales. Through her efforts, she preserved a vital part of Welsh identity and made it accessible to a wider audience. Her translation remains one of the most influential to this day, influencing later historians who sought to further examine and celebrate the Welsh literary tradition. She was both more than a wife, a translator, or even a philanthropist. She was a leader who shaped the course of industry, culture, and education in 19th century Wales. And even though she came from England, is just as Welsh in her thinking as anybody else that lived there. And there is a great debt that is owed to the work that she did in preserving these documents and allowing us the opportunity to still be able to read and use them to this day. So often, I know from my own research and my own commentary on the Victorian historians and archaeologists, I am very flippant and dismissive of some of their work. But let me be very clear about one aspect. Without them, the modern historical subject, and specifically the modern ideal of archaeology, with its preservation, with its understanding of how to recognize objects in situ and give it a chance to be understood when it was buried, is something that came out of this era. Our understanding and access to books, to letters, to screeds, to all sorts of things that were written in times past really only get a beginning in this era. Certainly without them, we would have probably lost track of at least some of these things, much like we did in the past. Keep in mind that there was a sense of dismissal about history at times, especially by different leaders and their different objectives. You just have to think of Henry VIII and the tearing down of the monasteries and how much we may have lost just simply because of that, or the Viking attacks that destroyed a number of religious sites, probably losing access to records that we might have had otherwise, or the sack of Rome, or any number of things you can think of over the history of the world that have caused us to lose track of and lose evidence of history. We're lucky to have what we have, and it must be acknowledged that the only reason why we have some of it is because of these Victorian people who actually started to take an interest and a concern in the history of their world and started to write it down, or at least started to understand it in a better standpoint and started to collect it so that we had access to it today. And with all of that said and done, I'd like to thank you all for listening and viewing today. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, you can always reach me at welshhistorypodcast@gmail.com. If you want to reach out to me on most social media, you can do that at Welsh History Pod, or on Facebook, you can visit our page at facebook.com/Welsh History Podcast. And if you would like to help finance this little podcast, you can do so at patreon.com/Welsh History. Thank you all once again. Have yourselves a wonderful rest of your day. Take care. Bye-bye. Welsh History Podcast is a member of the Evergreen Podcast Network. To find more information on them, you can do so at evergreenpodcasts.com. Thanks for listening.